Here's a question. If I say Holland, what do you think about? Windmills? Tulips? Clogs? Mice in windmills? Dancing in clogs? Unless you're Dutch, chances are you won't associate it with this rather creepy-looking old man. This is Richard Klinkhamer, or Klink as he preferred to be known, and he's notorious in the Netherlands. His wife disappeared suddenly in 1991. He evaded arrest, but then penned a book about several ways he could have killed her. It seems he was the OG-OJ.
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
He described in detail 7 ways in which he could conceivably have disposed of his wife, including pushing her piece by piece through a meat grinder and feeding her to seagulls. Understandably, his publisher was uncomfortable and the manuscript rejected. Fast forward a few years, and the new owners of Klinkhamer's property were landscaping their garden. While digging up the floor under an old shed, they made a grisly discovery. Stick around and find out just where Klink's plan went so terribly wrong. On March 20th, 1991, a police car stopped in front of Richard Klinkhamer's house in Ganzedijk. The 54-year-old author was taken to the police station for questioning. 6 weeks earlier, he had reported his 44-year-old wife, Hanny, missing, and not a soul had heard from her since. The residents of Ganzedijk strongly suspected the eccentric former legionnaire must have had something to do with it. After speaking to neighbours and acquaintances of the couple, the detectives concluded that Klinkhamer was probably involved in the disappearance. While he was interrogated for 47 hours straight, police officers searched his house and garden with sniffer dogs. They found no traces of a crime, but they confiscated items, including a meat grinder, a chopper, and various hooks. Klinkhamer had worked as a butcher in Amsterdam in the 50s and 60s and still regularly slaughtered sheep and chickens for his own consumption. 13 years earlier, in 1978, Klinkhamer and Hannelore, known as Hanny, had been married. Together they had bought a property in rural Ganzedijk, so that Richard had space and tranquility to write his novels. The house was purchased in Hanny's name. One frosty afternoon, on January the 30th, 1991, Hanny came home from work, and the couple got into a heated argument. Neighbours reported hearing shouting and high-pitched screams, and then everything went quiet. Hanny had disappeared, never to be seen again. To say Klinkhamer had had a bleak childhood would be something of an understatement. His mother, Maria, arrived in the north of Holland between the 2 world wars. She had, as he put it, das gewisse etwas, which translates as that certain something. In this case, that certain something was a sensual aura that makes all men's hearts race. She eventually married Jacob Klinkhamer, who happened to come to the residence where Maria was employed as a maid. Richard was their 3rd child, born in 1937. His father, Jacob, was loyal to Maria, but the same wasn't true for her. Initially, he forgave her multiple affairs, even when she became pregnant by the village constable, who, it later transpired, was Richard's biological father. After several years, the infidelity became too much, and the couple divorced. Maria got custody of the children, but then, deciding that 3 was too many to cope with, put 6-year-old Richard on a train to her brother in Austria. In 1945, when the country was liberated, Richard was traumatized by seeing his aunt viciously attacked by soldiers. He also learned about the murder of a number of local villagers and witnessed his uncle beaten and imprisoned for employing Polish labourers on their farm. During the war, his mother lived in Amsterdam and had been one of the numerous women to provide, quote, services of comfort to the occupying German soldiers. As a consequence, at the end of the war, she was hauled up in front of the public, forced to strip to her underwear, and had her head shaved as punishment in one of the ugly carnivals prevalent at that time. In case you're unfamiliar, ugly carnivals were a horrific phenomenon intended to shame and punish anyone, but predominantly women, who had assisted or collaborated with the enemy during occupation. Many victims were young mothers whose husbands were in German prisoner of war camps. During the war, they often had no means of support, and their only hope of obtaining food for themselves and their children was to submit to the demands of the German officers. As many as 20,000 women had their heads shaved during the carnivals, which took place in France, Belgium, Italy, Norway, and the Netherlands. After a time, Maria recovered and sent for Richard, now 8, who joined her in Amsterdam. However, the situation was far from ideal. She was selling herself to make ends meet, and the pair were moving aimlessly from one address to the next without any sense of security. She found temporary work with a Russian family, but the master of the house became too enamored with her, that sensual aura again, and they were cast out in a matter of weeks. Again, Richard was dispatched to another aunt. What he wasn't told was that she was gravely ill and had been given only months to live. He was present at the breakfast table 6 months later when she keeled head first into a plate of porridge and died. Richard was sent to live with his father and his 2 older half-brothers. Jacob had since remarried to another woman, unflatteringly described as unstable, nagging and austere. Needless to say, none of the boys got on with her, and it was here that Richard, aged 11, first learnt that his father wasn't actually his biological dad at all. Happily, Jacob Klinkhamer made no distinction between his sons and treated them all kindly, and it's said that the following years were perhaps the most stable in Richard's life. But the brothers were a bad influence, teaching Richard to gamble, trade and steal on the streets. He became a butcher's apprentice until he was caught with his fingers in the till. At 18, he ran away and joined the Foreign Legion, serving 4 years from 1956, and was deployed against the Algerian independence fighters. He attempted to desert, which earned him several months in a penal camp. He made a second escape attempt, this time more successfully, arriving back in Amsterdam to his father and half-brothers via Italy. Having ditched the Foreign Legion, Klinkhamer struggled to find a job. An ex-legionnaire and a criminal, it seemed that no one wanted to know. After 18 months, he set up a butcher shop with his brothers in the centre of Amsterdam. This did well, and after a period they opened 2 more. During this time, Klinkhamer met his first wife, a woman named Leontine van Emmerik. She was the only child of a well-to-do family, who at first thought Richard a bit of a weirdo, before warming to him and recognising he had some charm and appeal, and good stories. The courtship between the two was a bit rocky, and he even broke it off twice, but when Leontine became pregnant, Richard decided to do the honourable thing, and they got married in 1962. Richard was 25 and Leontine 22. They went on to have a son and then a daughter. Richard remained in the butcher shop for 6 years, until selling up and moving into the catering industry. Shortly after the wedding, Richard's mother contacted him again. She asked all her sons to come and visit her in Switzerland and sent them all plane tickets. Richard's father was furious when he discovered his sons were once again in contact with Maria, and he and Richard eventually stopped talking. He passed away in 1982, but Richard was unaware of his death until many years later. Richard's mother survived until 1984, when at the age of 74, she confided in him that she'd had enough of her chronic illnesses and wanted to end her life. During one visit, they discussed her plans, and Richard later wrote in his diary, quote, "Mutti took the train from Locarno to Bellinzona. She laid herself next to the exit of the tunnel with her head on the rails and died instantly." It was said that despite his tumultuous childhood and the fact that he'd been shunted from pillar to post, he had, in later years, come to value their relationship and fully supported her right to decide what she thought was best, which seemed to include going out on her own terms. So how does Hanny, Richard's second wife, come into the picture? Well, Richard was introduced to Hanny around the same time he met Leontine. If you can believe it, Hanny had an even worse childhood than Richard. At age 10, she and her brother were adopted by Leontine's family. Their father had had severe psychological problems, and after a period of intense turmoil, Hanny had come home from school one afternoon to a horrific scene. During a fight, her father had taken a hammer to her mother's skull and pushed her down a flight of stairs. Hanny was the one to discover her mother, lifeless in the hallway. When Hanny came to live with the Van Emmerik family, Leontine was already 18 and engaged to Richard. By the time the couple married, Hanny was 15. According to Klinkhamer, he noticed quickly that Hanny began to show more than just a passing interest in him. And he even went as far as to say that, in his opinion, she possessed that certain something his mother had been blessed with, or in hindsight, should we say, plagued by. Although flattered, he did not respond. She was, after all, a child. Nevertheless, Hanny must have noticed some spark of interest and persisted. When she became 19, Hanny and Richard embarked on a passionate affair. To a certain extent, poor Leontine had been aware of their interest in one another, but felt powerless to stop it. She confessed later that even on her wedding day, in a fit of jealousy, Hanny had hissed, "I will destroy your marriage. He is for me." Though when asked about that years later, Klinkhamer strongly denied that Hanny had ever said it. Initially, Leontine turned a blind eye, perhaps hoping it was just a fling. But when it became apparent that this was not going to be the case, to keep the peace, she eventually suggested a solution. A ménage à trois. Yeah, that Hanny should actually move in with them. By this time, Richard and Leontine had 2 children, a relatively successful business, and understandably, she was unwilling to throw it all away. Unbelievably, the 3 carried on with this arrangement for some time, Richard alternating between sleeping in the marital bed and then in the adjoining guest house with Hanny, until the 2 women could stand it no longer. After 3 months, Hanny left, with Richard's assurance that he would leave Leontine when the children were a little older. Despite this, Leontine became pregnant the following month and gave birth to their 3rd child, a little girl. Leontine and Richard's marriage limped on for 3 years. At the beginning, Richard visited Hanny every week in Amsterdam. Leontine said that when Richard returned, Hanny regularly called her and teased her with lurid details about the couple's escapades. But again, Richard refused to believe she was capable of that. The situation deteriorated and the couple divorced in 1977. Klinkhamer maintained that he had tried to keep things as pleasant as possible with Leontine by giving her the house and a decent financial settlement, but that she was vengeful and difficult, denying him access to the children and keeping their infant daughter away from him altogether. By 1978, Richard and Hanny had married and moved to the little hamlet of Ganzedijk in the northeastern Netherlands. According to the other residents, they seemed like a harmonious couple, at first at least. They loved developing their garden, being outdoors, socializing, and each other. By 1983, Richard had found success in writing, having published his first novel, Obedient, Like a Dog, about his time in the French Foreign Legion. He appeared on television with talk show host Sonia Barent to discuss it and became something of a local celebrity. In truth, he seemed to relish the attention and, according to friends and neighbours, became more eccentric with every passing month. He would drink rather too much, dominate social gatherings, and voice his, quote, stubborn, confrontational and provocative social opinions. In short, people were irritated by his boastfulness and bravado. As my mother would say, a little of him went a long way. There were also stories about his fascination with the Second World War. Posters, books, and some questionable wartime memorabilia he called artwork adorned the walls of his writing studio. People said he ate spiders and stole chickens from his neighbours. Locals said he used to ride around the streets naked on a bicycle, though he maintained this was nonsense. He always wore his underpants. Hanny, meanwhile, worked as a nurse in the hospital at Winshaughten, taking the train to work most days. Richard spent his time gardening, writing, and, his latest obsession, gambling on the stock market. He was said to have a, quote, golden hand on the stock exchange. There are accounts of him making substantial sums, 50,000 guilder in a single day. To put that into perspective, that's nearly $30,000 back in the early 1980s. He surprised Hanny with gifts and jewellery. The outlook was rosy. The couple bought a house in Portugal and calculated that by the time Hanny was 50, they could retire and move there permanently. But Richard had been taking the most insane risks on the stock market, and as you can guess, it was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. After the market crash of 1987, over half of the couple's investments were wiped out overnight. Klinkhamer remortgaged the house in secret and gambled the remaining worth. After a fortnight, the market plunged still further, and his portfolio of stock was liquidated by the bank. They were completely broke, and Hanny was furious. It was said that after he worked up the courage to tell her, she didn't speak to him for days. Amidst this chaos, Richard's second book was published, The Hotel Rat and Other Stories. Catchy. It was not as popular as Obedient Like a Dog, but it still sold. Rats, dogs, sensing a sort of theme here. If you can believe it, his life with Hanny began to take on even more eccentric forms than previously. When he wasn't writing or drinking heavily, he was constructing a North African city from building waste in his garden. He laid new paths, hollowed out ponds for frogs, and dug many holes. Later he made a large hole under his shed in which he stored crates of beer, where they would stay cool in the summer. Indeed, after the stock market losses, it wasn't unusual for him to finish a crate of beer a day. Hanny was the only one working, and she was becoming extremely resentful about the situation. Richard took a temporary job as a night porter in a nearby hotel. The couple were arguing bitterly all the time. On January 30th, Hanny arrived home from work at the hospital and told Richard that her mind was made up and he needed to leave immediately. A disagreement ensued, and she packed a suitcase, not hers, but his. According to Klinkhamer, the argument became physical, with the couple yelling and pushing each other, before Hanny lunged at a crowbar resting on top of the washing machine and hit him. Richard prized it from her and struck back again and again. A few days later, Klinkhamer reported the disappearance of his wife. Her bicycle was found at the station in Winshaughten, seeming to imply she'd never even made it home. Richard spoke to the press and offered a reward for information. He was detained by the police and his property and garden thoroughly searched. When the investigation failed to turn up any leads, the authorities returned his meat grinder, hatchet and hooks. After a time, and because Hanny was officially registered as the household breadwinner, he was allowed to claim a widower's pension. After 5 years, Hanny was legally pronounced dead, and the house was transferred into Richard's name so that he could sell it. He waited 3 years before selling up and moving to Amsterdam. According to Klinkhamer, the intervening years passed restlessly. He wrote the first draft of a new novel, the now notorious Woensdag Gehaktdag, translated as Wednesday, Minced Meat Day. The title, he said, was in response to the absurd rumours circulating in the months after Hanny's disappearance about how he'd covered up his crime by putting her in a meat grinder. Not content with getting that off his chest, He put forth several other scenarios, each seemingly more far-fetched than the last, about what could have happened to her. The book was also full of confusion, fantasy, and provocative assertions presented by Klinkhamer in his trademark rhetorical style. His publisher, Willem Donker, was shocked, to put it mildly. He recalled their exchange at the time. "I'm sorry, Richard, but this won't do." "Why ever not? It's very graphic." Indeed. A bit too graphic. 7 ways to get away with killing your wife. Can you be serious? Isn't it a bit contentious, bearing in mind the disappearance of your own wife last year? Bearing in mind all I've been through, it's only reasonable I should speculate on what someone in a similar position might have done. Did you kill her? I'm not ready to talk about it yet. Ultimately, Donker couldn't be swayed, and Richard took several less controversial chapters and expanded on them to create a new novel, Ransom, which was published soon afterwards. But despite getting fairly favourable reviews in Austria, Germany and Switzerland, Klinkhamer never found success as an author in the Netherlands. People only seemed to be interested in him as the myth, and the eccentricities he'd cultivated just seemed to fuel the rumour mill. He attempted to date again, searching Lonely Hearts columns, but no one compared to Hanny, and he soon gave up and went back to drinking alone. John Shaw, a journalist with Dutch paper De Volkskrant, visited Richard after he moved to Amsterdam in 1997. Shaw described the author's demeanour as spooky and said he was really working with the fear of people. He made a lot of jokes about dark things and death. He had found himself a girlfriend, who at 24 was less than half his age. Marguerite de Heer, now a famed comic strip illustrator and still living in Amsterdam today, found him somewhat of an enigma and doubtless loved all the attention. She admitted later that Hanny had been, and still was, his greatest love, despite their time together. We know what happened next. In 2000, after Hanny's remains were discovered under the shed by contractors landscaping the garden, the jig was up. To absolutely no one's surprise, Richard was arrested and stood trial in 2001.
10 jaar gevangenisstraf geëist. Het Openbaar Ministerie overweegt in hoger beroep te gaan.
Eerst was het 10 jaar en dat werd 6 en dat is toen 7 jaar geworden.
After a short trial where he was convicted of manslaughter, Klink was sentenced to 7 years in, well, the Klink. In 2003, after serving just 2 years, he was released for good behaviour. I guess his publishers now considered his novel, Wednesday, Minced Meat Day, fair game, considering he'd paid his dues and all. The book met with some success, even getting a small print run in the USA at the time. But in truth, it wasn't the content, but the surrounding notoriety, the cult of Klink, that people were morbidly fascinated by. Indeed, some 11 years after his release in 2014, photography student Laura Nossen chose Richard as her muse for an art project and eventually a book released after his death. The two struck up an unlikely friendship, and she visited him on many occasions at home. She photographed him, and he shared bits of his writing, diaries and poems with her. Asked later whether she was ever nervous about visiting the convicted murderer at home, she replied, quote, "An understandable question, but no. I am convinced that Hanny's murder was an accident, the outcome of an argument, and that I never had anything to fear from him. We also didn't talk about the part of his life where he killed his wife. He did a lot of interviews at the time, and he always let me read them, so I knew what had happened." But, in the end, it seemed even Klink had become tired of playing the game. In January 2016, at the age of 78, he took his own life. For all of his bravado and pomposity, Klinkhamer's guilt was an anticlimactic reveal to what many had suspected all along. By writing a book and giving interviews, Klinkhamer committed, or rather repeated his crime in public, in front of his readers and the authorities? Was it a confession? A way of absolving himself of the guilt weighing heavily on him? Or had he, as some suggested, committed a murder for the material in his new novel? His acquaintances certainly didn't seem to think so. It had been a dreadful accident, nothing more. Established wisdom dictates that there are 3 sides to every story: his, hers, and the truth. It also suggests that truth is very often stranger than fiction, though in this case, I think one would have to disagree.